This is Tim Ventura from AmericanAntiGravity.com, and I'm speaking with Dr. Bonnie Dunbar, former astronaut and currently the director of the Museum of Flight in Seattle. Dr. Dunbar holds a Bachelor and Master's of Science degrees in ceramic engineering and a doctorate in mechanical biomedical engineering, and has been the recipient of over 20 special honors and awards from a variety of prestigious organizations for her scientific research. She's agreed to join us to talk about her past experiences with NASA and her current vision for the museum, as well as offer some of her insights into space exploration and paths for future research in breakthrough propulsion. Well, let's start out with your recent transition from NASA into the role of director at the Museum of Flight. Everything that I've heard about the astronaut program suggests that the lifestyle is really fast paced, and I'm wondering if your transition has finally allowed you to relax a bit, or if this new role is equally demanding in its own right.
Well, I'd have to say that this new role, while it's not as high in altitude, certainly is as demanding right now. I was very fortunate that I had about a month handover with the retiring president and CEO, but we've a lot on our hands right now, and so I can't say I'm bored.
Sure. Well, I guess it's always good to be able to transition to the role over a little bit of time instead of kind of coming in cold. So, well, with your experience and credentials, you really could have gone anywhere after working at NASA. What is it that attracted you to the museum position, and can you tell us a bit about some of your plans for the organization?
Well, the Museum of Flight in Seattle, which is located on Boeing Field, was actually started about 40 years ago by some Boeing engineers that wanted to preserve an airplane that had been found actually in a dump in Alaska. So they restored it, and it was formerly on the site of the World's Fair Center here in Seattle. Eventually, they were able to, and again, this was all on their own nickel, able to procure some facilities on Boeing Field. And over the years, they've been able to, they put a staff in place, a professional curator, bring up a collection to about 70, 80 aircraft, build a new building here on Boeing Field. The first big addition was called the Great Gallery, in which many of our airplanes, including a Wright Flyer replica, are suspended from a large gallery, so they look like they're flying because the gallery is all glass, so you can actually look through it and see outside. And then this last year, we opened something we call the Personal Courage Wing, which includes World War II and I airplanes. It's a collection of about 22 airplanes, but we also tell the story of the people. We also have a Japanese Zero, and we have a German MiG, and so forth. So that's the aviation part of it here that's displayed. Then we have a library and a collection that some of it's online right now, which is just really outstanding. We have some of the original Wright papers, including the first contract that he signed with the government. We have the Jepson collection, of course, kind of the father of modern navigation right now. And so we just received a big grant from the Dahlberg family, in which we are outfitting a new building across the street. So this library will have, we hope, more academic use as well. We have the beginning of a space collection. We have a Apollo capsule, and we actually have an unmanned capsule from Russia. And this Saturday we'll be accepting a moon rock from Dick Gordon, and next year we'll be accepting Pete Conrad's. These are NASA ambassador type of things where they get some moon rock to give to an institution, and they selected our institution to receive them. My future plans include growing out the space wing and also covering something we call the air park, where we have our commercial aircraft. We've got the very first 747 that was ever built, and it's a test bed. And we have the very first 707. We have Air Force One that flew from the time of Eisenhower up until Reagan. We have a British Airways Concorde, and so that large air park we'd eventually like to cover, and also use it to display technology development and give access to young undergraduate engineering students, for example, to come over and explore the development of technology. So there's a lot on our plate right now. We have about 500,000 visitors a year. We also have a K-12 education program. We have about 100,000 K-through students that come through 22 different programs, including a Challenger Learning Center and something we call the Aviation Learning Center. So it's a busy day every day, and I made the transition because Well, quite frankly, it's not that big a transition. I may not be flying in space, but I knew someday that flight career was going to end, and I wanted an opportunity to help give back to ensure that we don't forget our legacy in aviation and space, and to inspire the next generation to go farther than we have in the past. And so it's really been a wonderful experience. When they offered me the opportunity, I jumped.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. It sounds like there's just a remarkable amount going on right now. Well, I guess one of the things that I should ask about, because one of the common aspects between American Anti-Gravity and the Museum of Flight is preserving historical information. Now, in our case, a lot of this is actually 1960s era research, which was kind of the heyday of electrical engineering. And one of the things I'm finding is it ends up getting lost because people don't really consider it to be historical. Now, have you guys thought about integrating in more electronic document preservation so that people can access it online?
Well, actually, that's an excellent idea. There's a lot of different disciplines that can be anchored into aviation and space, for example. Uh, Aviation led to new developments in materials, for example, even into electronics and navigation. Space was new materials, and in fact, space was the motivator for the computer. So part of my vision for this covered air park is that underneath the airplanes, we can display the development of all of those technologies, including fly-by-wire, the transition from cables to fly-by-wire. And speaking of the gravity part of it, we're hoping to get a mock-up of the Destiny module on space station here within a year, and then we can really tell the story about all the research being done, because we think the space medicine, the microgravity research is part of the untold story as well.
Sure. Well, from your bio online, it looks like you've gone on 5 shuttle missions and
That's,
spent
that's right.
over a month in space altogether, right? So, I was wondering if you could describe the experience for us. And I actually felt guilty about writing this question out because I'm sure that's the one you always get asked. So.
Well, I don't mind it, because it was a very unique experience, and I'm hoping that working with our creative people here, because they do a much better job than I do, that we can collaborate on replicating that experience for people while they're on the Earth. Certainly we can't make them weightless, but I hope that somehow we can give them a sense of what it's like to orbit the Earth once every 90 minutes, to see this really incredible, beautiful planet, to fully appreciate why it's important to explore the heritage we have on exploration as a people, and how we must invest it in the future, and all those experiences that you might get from a space flight that in the future we'd like to be able to provide here.
Absolutely. Well, I do have a few more questions that are a lot more creative. I put a lot of time into drafting good questions that I thought no one had probably asked before. So
Okay.
I guess my next one is, given your doctorate in mechanical biomedical engineering, as well as your extended shuttle time, I'm sure that one of the questions that you wish more people asked about are the spacesuits. Now, these are big, bulky, and heavy, and it doesn't seem like they've improved a whole lot in the last 40 years. Do you think?
Well, you're talking about the EVA suits, and actually there's been a lot of improvements between the time of Apollo and Shuttle, but since the beginning of Shuttle, the suits really haven't changed that much, largely because we haven't been able to, when I was with NASA, of course, been able to procure the funding to make that happen. I really feel that will be the next big change that you will hopefully see. There certainly was funding in new research and development for suits, but in addition to the technology, whether it be the oxygen supplies, the carbon dioxide removal, the communication systems and so forth, they really need to figure out how to fit people better, make the suit more transparent to the work, and fit a lot of different people. When I was with NASA, we were having some problems in budgeting to make suits, to provide suits that fit everybody. And so they actually were eliminating sizes because of budget problems, and therefore people weren't being assigned to flights because they didn't have a suit to fit. Well, that's simply not a very good or wise, I think, investment. You put all the investment in training someone. We should find a way to help build equipment for them to be able to do their job. And so I think there's some challenges out there that if we're going to go back to the moon, continue work on the space station, and go on to Mars, which will require a wholly different suit than we have on the moon, then we really need to take a very close look at that.
Sure. Well, on the subject of suits, NASA has a fact sheet online claiming that each suit weighs around 280 pounds.
Hmm.
Now, I'm guessing that it's probably closer to 100 without the backpack and maybe the helmet, but it brings to mind kind of the interesting point and question that I thought up, which was making it from the suit room to the actual shuttle, which must be just a nightmare to achieve.
Well, we don't wear that suit back and forth on launch and entry. The suit they're talking about is the suit that we wear doing extravehicular activities after we're out in orbit, when you're in a vacuum. That we have two different suits. We have a pressure suit, an orange pressure suit that we wear on launch and entry, and that actually wasn't designed first for NASA. That was designed for high-altitude Air Force pilots as a full pressure suit. And we take those off once we get onto orbit, and we re-don them when we get back for entry, and we can walk out to the pad in those. I mean, there's a parachute that we get into when we're in the seat, but they're not overly cumbersome. Of course, the suits that we put on to do spacewalks in a hard vacuum, you don't have to worry about the weight because you are weightless. But they're called hard upper torso because they have a very rigid, molded chest part. They've got legs and arms that can be adjustable, but when you pressurize this suit, it becomes like a hard balloon, and we have a delta pressure of 5 psi, or about 4.8 between the suit and vacuum, and it becomes very hard to move around in them. It's not so much the weight, because that's mass, and you don't see that. It's more the cumbersome and the rigidity of the suit that becomes a problem.
Sure, sure. Well, I know they do a lot of photo ops with these suits. Have you ever had to kind of shuffle around with, kind of the fake smile during the camera sessions, or?
You mean for the crew photos?
Yeah.
You're exactly right. Of course, when you see them in the photo sessions, they do not have the backpack on, and that's because has the oxygen in it. Sometimes they'll have a mock-up, but you're not seeing a fully loaded suit when you see them in the photo sessions.
Oh, sure. Well, I guess the next question is, and this just kind of spontaneously came to me because I have a fear of heights. I'd guess that the shuttle is probably the only place where you can simultaneously trigger a fear of heights as well as claustrophobia and agoraphobia all at the same time. Do astronauts ever have panic attacks? And if so, how do they handle that during a busy mission schedule?
Well, I think most of that's screened out during selection and career selection. If you're a fighter pilot or even a jet pilot, you're getting into a fairly closed space. You're putting a helmet on and you're putting a mask over your face. If you're not comfortable with that at the outset, you're not going to progress on into your field. So in a weightless environment, by the way, it feels roomier because you can float up to the ceiling if you need to. And I think that by the time people start training on the shuttle and they're well into their career, they've already determined whether they're going to have these problems or not. So we haven't really seen them in the professional astronaut corps.
Oh, okay. The reason I'd written that was I know a few Air Force pilots who actually are afraid of heights, and I always thought that was, incredibly brave or incredibly dumb. So one of those two. Well, I guess a lot of Americans put the astronauts onto a pedestal, of kind of virtue and honor and a lot of those American values that realistically King Arthur himself probably couldn't live up to. But that the reality of life is that nobody has a perfect day every day. I'm wondering if you've ever felt overwhelmed at some of the superhuman expectations that come with the space program, not just the taxing physical requirements, but also the emotional burden of the expectations that people have for behavior and attitudes, even in your off-duty moments.
Never overwhelmed. I think if you're overwhelmed, you're not doing your time management properly. I think I'm always conscious of the expectation, and I was when I took the job. It's more, I think, always remembering that we are a government employee, and we have certain expectations that have to do with our sense of integrity and our behavior, and that we're representing the U.S. government, and that's just part of what we do, and whether it's in this job or in the military or as a civil servant. But it's not overwhelming. It's something, personally that I chose.
Sure. Well, NASA tends to get a lot of criticism in the press, and I think a lot of that is probably just from the cultural pride that we take in our space program. But, it's a government agency, and it has flaws just like any other. But for some reason, we tend to freak out when something goes wrong with NASA, and maybe not so much with other programs. Now, from an insider's perspective, if you were someday appointed as the head of NASA, are there any changes that you'd make to our space program?
Well, let's take back go back to the original premise, and that is the reporting on the flaws. I think one of the most frustrating things I dealt with inside NASA was that many of those reports simply weren't correct or accurate or misinterpreted. I feel that in the last couple of decades that there's been an effort to try to find things that are wrong instead of applauding what has been achieved, is to criticize failure in research and development. And there's a downside to that for our young. We're in R&D because if we already knew the answer, it wouldn't be research, and there's going to be failure. But we try to minimize it. We hire smart people. We try to do the best job. The important thing is to recognize in NASA is they don't hide those mistakes. They're in the public. We investigate them publicly, and they're for the nation, and we proceed on. If we only recognize those times we fail and then ostracize people when they fail, what it does is it sends a message to our young people that they shouldn't try at all because of that fear of failure. So I was, we made our share of mistakes, and we tried to own up to them and investigate them publicly. I think there are nations on this earth that don't do that. So we'll take those lumps. But I think it would be unfair to say that everything was reported was true. It simply wasn't. And I think there has to be a balance in what we report on our achievements in space.
Sure. Well, on the subject of making changes, one of the things that I've been really proud of is American Anti-Gravity's participation in delivering a joint proposal to Mike Griffin. This is something that's coming up in mid-December, and I guess the subject of our proposal is to try and engage NASA in community-based open-source breakthrough propulsion research. I guess this is kind of a two-part question. The first being whether you think there's any merit to adding breakthrough propulsion research as a permanent fixture to the NASA program, and the second being, of course, whether you'd be interested in reviewing our proposal before we send it in.
Well, I have to tell you, I'm a materials focused person in terms of my education and expertise, not propulsion, but I love reading new technology, so I'd be happy to read it. I just can't say I'll be the expert reviewer on it. But I think breakthrough propulsion is critical to the future. I realize that NASA has to make some balanced decisions based on the budget right now, but certainly my friend and colleague from my class, Franklin Chang Diaz, was looking at breakthrough propulsion. He's definitely a good source to review a proposal on that. But, as we look out into the future and we talk about going to Mars and we talk about 6-month trips out and back, we really need to find ways of overcoming the capabilities we have now in, liquid propulsion and maybe even ion propulsion and going on to some of the other systems.
Absolutely. Well, I think a lot of the limitations with breakthrough propulsion, again, come from these cultural factors. We have 70 years of science fiction that's given us so many positive and negative attitudes about this stuff that it makes it a real challenge to look at it rationally without bringing in that emotional baggage.
Well, I think our technical groups try to sort through that. That if you find the right peer review group, their reputation is based on the fact that they're not coloring their attitudes with emotion. I think sometimes there is a confusion between an emotional answer and a fiscal answer. I'm still disappointed in the NASA budget. When you think about it, when we went to the moon, it was 4.4% of the federal budget, and it was just primarily space. It's currently, I think, about 0.7 or 0.8 of the federal budget, and it has many more missions than it did before. And it's not educating our university youth like it did when I went to school. I have much of my ability to go to college when I was young based on government resources. And NASA's always had a tradition of putting at least $1 billion a year into the universities. So if we're going to educate the next generation and be competitive, we need to be sure that we continue that. So I'd like to see us increase the resources so that we can umbrella this type of research.
Absolutely. Well, and I think the BPP budget, even if it was at its maximum, would probably top out at maybe 1% of the current NASA budget, which it sounds like you might be suggesting could be tripled or quadrupled overall.
Well, there's been a number of studies, external studies done over the last, when I was with NASA, it was 27 years, but I can't think of a single study that said we should decrease funding. All of them said we should increase it, particularly if we're going to be a competitive nation in the future. And as we look around us right now and we look at where the Europeans are going and the Chinese and so forth, we're right at a cusp, I think a decision cusp as to whether we're even going to stay in the same league in the next 15 to 20 years.
Absolutely. Well, I'd like to touch briefly on private space flight because one of the things that occurred to me, and I could be making a complete mistaken judgment on this, but NASA for all of the failures that people ascribe to it has always been first and foremost about safety. And one of the things that worried me looking at some of the X Prize vehicles were the potential for big safety issues by making them lighter weight, making them maybe a little bit less durable, stuff like using polycarbonate in a hard radiation environment where it might break down. Do you think there are any issues that might come to light from the faster, better, cheaper private sector mentality?
Well, I can't speak for that sector, but there's oversight on the industry, and I had the opportunity to listen to Burt Rutan and his folks talk at Oshkosh this summer, and he was very cognizant of the fact that they needed to keep the industry safe. In fact, he invited government involvement in that because that was one of his prime focuses. He realized that if it became unsafe in this early part of the development, that it could very well undermine the progress of commercial space. So there'll need to be some oversight and regulation and self-regulation, but it is a new and emerging industry. There's likely to be, on a probability basis, some losses, but we shouldn't let that deter the industry. People will be taking some individual risk. This gets back to, risk assessment. We get into an automobile every day, or most of us do, knowing that there's a large loss annually based on getting into an automobile, but we still make what we think is a rational risk assessment.
Oh, it's an excellent point. Well, I guess the other question is about the public getting into space in general, in terms of, well, I guess this really comes from an interview I did with Peter Diamandis in March, and he shared a projected cost chart with me that showed the cost to orbit going down to around $1,000 per pound with private spacecraft. Now, for satellite deployments, things that major corporations finance, that's a really great value. But it still means that the average person is going to have to pay around $200,000 to get into space. My question is whether there's any way for the common man to reach space without some type of BPP technology involved.
Well, I don't know. I can't look that far ahead or have that much depth. I don't have all the data, at my hands. We originally talked about safety, and I think that's a philosophy. The market analysis is going to be quite different. I can only, rely a little bit on history because we have some of the original air transport planes here, is that it started out very expensive, but as the market multiplied, the cost per ticket went down, and someone can only hope that that happens in space as well.
Sure, sure. Well, one of the other issues, I guess, relates to public relations, because this public desire to participate in space, I think, extends past people's wanting to go there. I think Americans in general just want to participate in helping mankind achieve those new heights of space research. Now, in terms of, I guess, collaborative open source efforts, do you think that might be something like the proposal that we're sponsoring that could really help NASA's PR efforts?
Well, I haven't seen the proposal. I apologize for that. I don't know. I think that it is important to not focus on the differences between different strategies, but focus on the bigger picture to ensure that we as a nation stay pro-exploration and pro-space as a mode of transportation. If we expect to be in 100 years, when people fill their museums, will they look at us and say, well, here was a nation like those in past history who got to a point and then lacked the will to go further? So I think we need to look more collectively as a nation about how we're going to proceed further.
Oh, absolutely. Well, we're almost out of time today, but I'd like to close with actually a simple question. Where do you think the space program will be in the next 50 years?
Oh, that's a really good question. Of course, anyone who's ever been asked that kind of question usually fails 50 years later. I'd tell you where I'd like to see us. I'd like to see the United States maintain a leadership in space exploration and put its resources and budget there now, and especially in the educational sector, because that's where our next generation of science and engineers are going to come from. And because I think there's also a link between our technological leadership and our world influence, and I hope that our leaders are taking a close look at that investment right now.
Absolutely. Well, and if nothing else, it'll definitely provide lots more materials in the future for the museum. So.
Well, I'm hopeful that we will be considered a quality museum someday, that will see a shuttle when it retires, but I'm also very saddened to see it possibly retire. And it's kind of one of those things, you see stuff come in, and at the same time you want to make sure that we're continuing to go forward.
Absolutely. Well, I'd like to thank you again for your time and give our audience your URL at www.museumofflight.org. It's been a wonderful experience to capture your thoughts and expertise, and I'd like to wish you the best of luck in the new role at the museum.
Thank you very much, and we welcome all visitors. Love to see you here.